Russia warns of a proxy war after the US sends special forces to Syria. President Barack Obama is reneging on his promise never to put American boots on the ground in Syria. So is deepening US and Russian involvement making a resolution to the civil war even more difficult? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jane Dutton. It is hard not to see the decision to send US special forces to Syria as evidence of a significant change in policy for Barack Obama. The US president repeatedly made a commitment to pulling troops out of Middle Eastern wars, not sending more there. The White House insists US military experts will help coordinate local fighters, not engage in frontline combat. Russia's foreign minister isn't convinced. Sergey Lavrov said the US move was decided unilaterally and without reference to the Syrian leadership. He added, "I'm sure that neither the United States nor Russia want the conflict to become a so-called proxy war. But it is obvious for me that the situation makes the task of cooperation between the militaries more relevant." The White House announcement coincided with foreign ministers meeting in Vienna to discuss the war in Syria. For the first time, Iran was invited, so was Russia, President Bashar al-Assad's other main ally. His main opponents, Turkey, Saudi Arabia and the United States, were also at the table. The ministers failed to agree on Assad's future, but plan to ask the United Nations to work on a ceasefire and new elections. And they've scheduled another round of talks in 2 weeks' time. Lots to discuss today. Let's bring in our guests. In Washington, D.C., David Mack, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs, responsible for U.S. relations with Syria. And in Moscow, Vladimir Sotnikov, strategic analyst at the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Good to have you both with us on Inside Story. David Mack, is that what we're looking at here? A proxy war looming between the US and Russia?
Well, I hope not. I would worry if there wasn't also this very important parallel move underway to set up a scenario for negotiations leading to a political evolution in Damascus. I would say that you have to look at this from a sort of 365 degrees right around the compass, because what's taking place right now in Syria with a few dozen American special forces people being placed on the ground is far less important than the deployment of aircraft that's taking place probably while we speak to Incirlik Air Base, A-10, A-15 aircraft, which will greatly multiply the strike capacity that the United States can bring to bear in northern and eastern Syria, where it has been operating and expects to continue to operate. The Russian operations, on the other hand, are in the west and central area. The deconfliction talks that have already taken place on a military-to-military basis between the United States and Russia seem to have been handled very professionally.
So hold on, can I jump in here? Is what you're saying that the area that will be controlled by the military, the US or Russian, are so well segregated that there won't be any sort of crossover? Is that what you're suggesting?
I wish I could say that with certainty, but I think it's going to require continuing close military-to-military coordination between the Russians and the United States and the Turks, who also will be involved with aircraft in this area. That's going to be absolutely essential in order to deconflict air operations. But the bigger question is how this builds towards some kind of political settlement, because one issue upon which the U.S. and Russia are very much in agreement is that there can't really be a military solution to this problem. Bashar al-Assad and his military are not going to be able to suppress all the Syrian rebel elements. And the United States has long been telling Syrian rebel groups that they should give up any idea of the military overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, as opposed to getting to some kind of political talks, resuming the Geneva talks, for example, that we thought had been making some progress until they were broken off essentially by the refusal of the Syrian government to engage in serious negotiations.
Okay, but what we're seeing now on the ground and in the skies doesn't reflect no military solution as being the answer, does it, Vladimir Sotnikov? I mean, if anything, the Russians and the US are getting more involved from a military point of view.
Well, actually, I agree with David, actually, that for the moment, I cannot see direct dangers for both great powers, I mean, for the US and for Russia, to cross over this line of separation line between their actions in Syria, actually. And regarding the proxy war, I think that the danger actually is that if the rebels against the legitimate Syrian government would continue their military operations, and because I have a feeling that they would still think that probably the best way to cope with the Syrian situation is to crush the military blow to the government of Bashar al-Assad. By the way, I would like to say that this decision of the U.S. government really against any practice of asking the government which is in power, I mean the legitimate government of Bashar al-Assad, whether he agrees for the American, even this couple of dozens of U.S. special services servicemen.
Okay, let me put that to David Mack, because that's what the Russian foreign minister said, that if you are to get involved on the ground, the U.S., then you have to get the permission, you have to be given the permission by Bashar al-Assad. So is this a conversation that the U.S. will be having with him?
Well, I think that a distinguished academic like Vladimir Sotnikov would agree that there's no real qualitative difference between the need for getting permission from the government with regard to air operations. That's not really very different from the need to get, in principle, to get agreement for ground operations. And the U.S. has been conducting air operations over Syrian skies for something like 2 years now. So there's a pretty good understanding indirectly between Damascus and the United States that as long as our military operations are not aimed at taking down the Syrian government, they may in fact be complementary to military actions, at least some of the military actions that Damascus says it would like to undertake against the so-called Islamic State or Daesh. I think the whole point here is that we're going to have to rely upon the Russians to make sure that there's a good understanding in Damascus about what our intentions are and what the limits of our military operations are. And at the same time, the Russians are going to have to rely upon us that when we say that we're not encouraging Syrian rebel groups to plan for the military overthrow of the Bashar al-Assad government, that's a fact. It's a fact because we've recognized it realistically, and it's also something that that would be deeply divisive within the Washington policy community. What we do have we have a priority to defeat this so-called Islamic State, and we're working around the borders of Syria with countries like Turkey, with Iraq, with Jordan, and with Lebanon. to say nothing of Saudi Arabia and others, to make that happen.
David,
And
I'm going to jump in here and throw it to Vladimir. Vladimir, that sounds all good and well, but what will happen if US troops strike by accident, Russian troops, or vice versa? I mean, there are so many different players on the ground at the moment backing opposing sides. I mean, how come we are not preparing for the mother of all battles?
Well, hopefully this situation will never be looming, actually. That will never, in other words, I hope very much that it will never happen. But the war is the war, actually, I mean, with all its consequences. And you are right in saying that too many players in the Syrian front, Daesh militants, Islamist militants, and rebel groups, and Kurdish, Peshmerga, other stakeholders who are actually fighting in the Syrian front. So I think I agree with David in what he was answering your first question, that we actually, as I assume from the yesterday's foreign minister meeting, we have first of all reached an understanding with our US partners regarding Syrian situation. And I agree with David that upon the basis of this understanding and the compromise, the military-to-military contacts are very much, this is a crucial thing actually, that the military of both countries should actually work hard to prevent this situation, to prevent this chance, even this tiniest chance of any fighting against each other by the U.S. special services men and the Russian military advisor. So I think, I hope that this situation will never end. But wholly exclude this situation, that will be unrealistic, because the war is a war. But I hope that, again, I'm telling that there should be the military cooperation 24 hours a day.
Right, I can feel the fingers being crossed there. Let's talk a little bit more about Obama's announcement about American troops in Syria, which directly contradicts his previous speeches. Here's what he said 2 years ago.
I will not put American boots on the ground in Syria. I will not pursue an open-ended action like Iraq or Afghanistan. I will not pursue a prolonged air campaign like Libya or Kosovo.
Obama spoke on Syria 12 months later, promising that American military involvement would stay strictly in the air.
And the best way to defeat a group like ISIL isn't by sending a large number of American combat forces to wage a ground war in the heart of the Middle East. That wouldn't serve our interests. In fact, it would only risk fueling extremism even more.
David, Barack Obama's comments there were said within specific contexts, and yet saying now that he would be putting boots on the ground, I mean, that's a dramatic U-turn.
Well, I think it has to be understood that there's really no contradiction between having peace talks and for an overall political settlement, having military-to-military deconfliction between the United States and Russia, and at the same time, for both Russian military forces and U.S. military forces to be prosecuting certain activities against certain specific groups. This will become a problem for the United States if the Russian military attacks took place upon friendly Syrian rebel forces, Syrian Kurdish forces with which the United States is working closely. But we understand that there might be other groups that we and the Russians agree are opposed to both the Bashar al-Assad regime and to the Syrian people, and that would include the so-called Islamic State. It would include Jabhat al-Nusra. So it is a confused situation over there, but I can see real merit in taking this opportunity to get active peace talks started so that the Syrians will understand.
So are you saying, excuse me, jumping in here, that the timing of this announcement, I mean, clearly a strategic one, I would assume, and that it's giving the US more leverage, is it?
Jane, I understand your question, and it's the same question that's been raised by the Washington Press Corps. Why is the announcement timed this way? Why does it come so soon after an escalation of Russian military activities? Mm-hmm. And I think that that is largely a coincidence. First of all, U.S. military operations have been going on for some time. They have, from time to time, involved some American special forces coming down on the ground in Syria for special operations. And they've involved continuing air operations, which are far more important and are about to be multiplied several times over because of the cooperation between Turkey and the United States and the use of Incirlik Air Base. Those are the big military developments. The importance of the special forces that are going in to the area around Kobani, a Kurdish, mixed Kurdish-Arab areas, is that this will put some special American air controllers on the ground. They will be able to direct the US A-10 aircraft, which is an extremely capable ground attack aircraft, moves slowly, has huge amounts of power, flies very low, and is perfect for supporting the Kurdish and Syrian rebel groups that are fighting against the Islamic State.
Let's bring in Mario Abou Zeid from Beirut. He's a Middle East expert, and good to have you with us. I'm intrigued to know what you make of Barack Obama's announcement that he would be putting troops on the ground. What sort of impact do you think this is likely to have? And how does it differ from his recent foreign policy pledges?
Well, this decision came after the Vienna talks and after the involvement of the Russian Federation in the Syrian crisis, which practically gave an uplift for the Assad regime. So practically, this very small force, which is less than 50 men of the Special Operations Group from the United States Army that will be deployed in Syria, it's only about coordination between the Syrian opposition and the coalition in order to improve their efficiency and their impact inside the crisis and against the Islamic State, because we saw how much the airstrikes campaign launched by the Russians is practically not only targeting the Islamic State, but only targeting the Syrian opposition and rebel groups on several fronts, which is practically supporting the Assad regime. So when this decision was taken, it was taken from a perspective to bring in, again, a balance against this advance of the Assad regime in order to maintain the equality of operations between both the opposition and the Assad regime, in order to give some kind of hope for the Vienna talks to have some fruitful and prepare some positive impact in order to prepare for the political transition.
Okay, as we know, this contradicts what he's said in the past about not getting involved in countries like this. You become part of the quagmire, you can't come out, promise no boots on the ground. And he said that he wouldn't put boots on the ground because of the risk that it would fuel extremism. I mean, isn't there still that danger now?
Well, it is still the same. Practically, as we've been saying since the beginning of the crisis, putting boots on the ground will be the most dangerous, because it will allow the jihadist community and the global terrorist group to be more supportive of whether the Islamic State or any extremist group on Syrian territories. So practically, this is not a game changer, or this is not a complete change in the foreign policy of the Obama administration. Practically, this is a very small group of advisors that will be leading and that will be practically facilitating the communication between the rebel groups and the coalition airstrikes, rather than actual battle force that is fighting on the ground.
Vladimir, let's talk about the fact that all of these players now, friends, enemies, are sitting around the same table talking about what to do in Syria, and yet the Syrians aren't there. Why not? Isn't that, I mean, if you want to talk about a proxy war, isn't that proof that we're looking at proxy wars here in Syria?
Well, it's a fair question, actually. I would like to say, first of all, let me greet our colleague from Beirut, and it's good that he is with us. But I do not agree that with him in principle that the operation of Russian Space Force in Syria is wholly aimed at supporting the Bashar al-Assad government and fighting against opposition forces. So-called opposition forces are practically rebels. Because I do not agree with that at all, because the main aim, actually, as it was said by Foreign Minister Lavrov, for example, and I agree with that, I can see that this is to crush Daesh, this is to crush the Islamism and jihadism in Syria, because this is the real danger. But well, actually, this is the big question. And answering your question, actually, I think that it's a good thing that sitting in the Vienna talks. Yes, you're right, friends and enemies, reached an understanding, a compromise. This is already the beginning of the process. Who said that this process would be easy and would be fast? I think this is just the beginning of the process, because the main thing is just to attract, to involve all political forces which are actually at odds, to put it mildly, at odds in Syria, which are fighting. And this is the main thing, I think, which the negotiations in Vienna is aimed to. But the fact that already between the great powers there is an understanding, and there is an understanding which is turning to the cooperation, this is a great thing. And this is a great thing that everybody understands that no military solution is possible in case of Syria.
David, do you think there's an understanding that Assad shouldn't leave before the process starts, that it doesn't make sense, that there would be too much of a vacuum?
This is certainly the U.S. understanding. And we are working to gain the agreement of our allies, countries like Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Turkey, and the more responsible Syrian rebel units, to understand that you simply don't want to have a sudden vacuum in Damascus and total turmoil result, because that will only help this so-called Islamic State move in and take control. The important thing is to set up a process that leads to a gradual evolution and the eventual departure of Bashar al-Assad and a more inclusive government in Damascus. And the United States certainly agrees with Russia and some other parties that the future government in Syria needs to protect the rights of minorities. That includes Alawites, it includes Christians and Druze and others.
Mario, what do you make about the agreements on all sides about the next stage for Syria in order to prevent a military solution?
Well, there is a lack of mechanisms and tools in order to enforce any kind of decision that would be agreed upon within these talks. Because in the very first round of talks, the multilateral talks in Vienna, we saw that neither the opposition groups or the Assad regime was represented, but we saw that all the regional backers are there, and practically they are deciding upon them. So practically, when anything would be decided in these talks, or try to implement any plan to reach some kind of ceasefire between the various belligerents, or try to make it more of a peaceful process, there is no one practically to enforce the implementation of such decisions that could be taken inside of Vienna, of the Vienna talks, no matter how these regional backers would be supportive.
Okay, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, Mario Abou Zeid, and I'm sure we'll get some more clarification in a couple of weeks' time when the world powers meet again to discuss Syria. Thank you very much, David Mack, for talking to us, Vladimir Sotnikov, and in Beirut, Mario Abou Zeid. And thank you for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the program's page of our website, aljazeera.com, and you can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And remember, you can always tweet us at AJ Inside Story and at Jane Dutton. Thank you very much for watching.